8 words. That's all it took to shatter everything I believed about my place in my own home. She's not my daughter anyway. The letter sat on his desk, handwritten, unsealed, as if he wanted me to find it. Or maybe he simply didn't think I mattered enough to hide it from. I was 17 years and 11 months old. I had 29 days, and I didn't wait. What I did next would set off a chain of events spanning 2 decades. A vanishing act, a disconnected phone line, an inheritance he never saw coming. And 20 years later, a knock on my door from a man who had lost everything, including the right to call himself my father. Hello, everyone. I'm Ondine Delaney, 38 years old. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when you wait long enough for the truth to find its own way into the light. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. The house on Maple Creek Drive had been my mother's dream. A white colonial with black shutters, a wraparound porch, and a backyard where she'd planted roses every spring. She bought it in 2015, 3 years before she married Richard Calloway, and 4 years before the cancer took her from me. By the time I was 17, I barely recognized the place. The roses were gone. Richard said they attracted too many bees. The porch swing where Mom and I used to read together had been replaced by 2 rigid Adirondack chairs that no one ever sat in. And her study, the room where she'd built her consulting business from scratch, had been locked since the week after her funeral. "This is my office now," Richard had told me when I was 12, pocketing the key. "You don't need to go in there." I didn't argue. Back then, I thought keeping the peace meant keeping my family together. The photographs were the first thing I noticed changing. Mom's portrait in the living room, the one from her 40th birthday, where she's laughing with her head thrown back, disappeared one Tuesday while I was at school. In its place hung a framed certificate, Richard Calloway, Rotary Club Member of the Year, 2021. "Where's Mom's picture?" I asked at dinner that night. Richard didn't look up from his steak. "It was faded. I put it in storage." Bradley, his son from his first marriage, smirked into his mashed potatoes. He was 22 then, still living at home, still treating me like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I nodded and said nothing. The Honda Accord in the garage, the car Mom had left specifically to me in her will, required Richard's permission to drive. "Insurance reasons," he explained. I believed him. I believed a lot of things back then. Dinner at the Calloway house followed a script. Richard at the head of the table, Bradley to his right, me at the far end, close to the kitchen, convenient for clearing plates. It was a Thursday in March 2025, 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, when I first understood how invisible I'd become. "The foundation board meets next Tuesday," Richard announced, cutting his roast beef into precise squares. "Bradley, I want you there. It's time you learned how these things work." Bradley straightened in his chair. "The Eleanor Hayes Foundation?" "That's the one." Richard's voice carried the particular warmth he reserved exclusively for his son. "Your stepmother built something special. Someone needs to carry it forward." I set down my fork. "I could come too. Mom always said, 'You have school.'" Richard didn't look at me. "Focus on graduating first." "But it's Mom's foundation. I thought maybe—" "Ondine." The single word landed like a door slamming shut. "Bradley has a business degree. You're a high school student. There's a natural order to these things." Bradley reached for the breadbasket, his expression carefully neutral. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He simply existed in a world where I didn't factor into the equation. "What are your plans after graduation?" Richard asked, his tone shifting to something almost conversational, almost paternal. "I'm looking at Ohio State. Maybe business, like Mom." "Don't count on anyone else to fund that." He returned to his roast beef. "I've got a meeting with the lawyers next week. Estate matters. Nothing you need to worry about." The words hung in the air. Nothing you need to worry about. I finished my dinner in silence, replaying that phrase. Estate matters. Lawyers. Next week. Something cold settled in my stomach, and it wasn't the food. The spare key had always been in the kitchen drawer, hidden beneath the rubber bands and expired coupons. Mom showed me when I was 10. Just in case, she'd said, pressing it into my palm. This house is yours too, baby. Never forget that. Richard left for his Rotary meeting at 6:30 on Saturday evening. Bradley was at a friend's house. I had maybe 2 hours. The study door opened with a soft click that sounded like a thunderclap in the empty house. Everything had changed. Mom's mahogany desk was buried under Richard's files. Her bookshelves, once filled with business texts and poetry collections, now held golf trophies and framed handshakes with local politicians. The room smelled like his cologne, sharp, aggressive, nothing like the lavender Mom used to wear. I needed my birth certificate for my college applications. That was the reason I told myself as I rifled through the filing cabinet. A legitimate reason, a legal document that belonged to me. The letter was sitting on top of the desk, weighted down by a brass paperweight shaped like a lion, unsealed, unfolded, as if he'd been reading it recently. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately, the sharp slant, the aggressive loops. Dear Mr. Patterson, regarding our discussion about the estate restructuring, proceed as planned. Once she turns 18, kick her out. She's not my daughter anyway. The asset transfer should be completed before her birthday to avoid any legal complications. Eleanor's accounts need to be consolidated under my name before the girl has any claim. R. Calloway. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page. The letter, the envelope addressed to Patterson and Associates Family Law, the date in the corner, March 3rd, 2025. 29 days before my birthday. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, locked the door, and returned the key to its drawer. Then I sat in my room and made a plan. 29 days. I wrote the number on a post-it note and stuck it inside my closet door where no one would see it. Every morning, I crossed off another day. A countdown to either my destruction or my escape. The math was simple, and it was devastating. According to Richard's letter, the asset transfer would be completed before my 18th birthday. That meant whatever Mom had left me, whatever she'd worked her entire life to build, would be gone before I could legally claim it. I knew the rough numbers. Mom's life insurance policy, $500,000, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. Her investment accounts, somewhere around $300,000 by the time she passed. The house, which she'd bought outright before marrying Richard. Her share of the consulting business she'd sold in 2018. All of it was supposed to come to me. But I had no access. No statements. No passwords. Richard had handled everything since Mom's death, and I'd let him because I was 12 years old and drowning in grief, and he was the only adult left in my life. I'd let him because I thought he loved me. Sitting on my bed that night, I pulled up the photo of the letter on my phone. She's not my daughter anyway. The words blurred as my eyes watered, but I blinked the tears away. Crying wouldn't save me. I thought about Mom in her final weeks, how she'd grip my hand with surprising strength. I've arranged everything, she'd whisper. Don't trust Richard. If anything happens, find Margaret Thornton. Promise me. I was 12. I'd nodded without understanding. Now I was 17 years and 11 months old, and I finally understood. I found the business card in my jewelry box, tucked behind a pair of earrings Mom had given me. Margaret Thornton, Eskrana Thornton and Associates. The next morning, I called in sick to school. The law office of Thornton and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building in downtown Columbus, 45 minutes from Maplewood. I'd told Richard I had a stomach bug. He barely looked up from his newspaper. Margaret Thornton was 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. When I walked into her office, she rose from her desk and studied my face for a long moment. You look just like her, she said quietly. Sit down, Ondine. I've been waiting for this call for 6 years. I handed her my phone with the photo of Richard's letter. She read it without expression, then set the phone down and folded her hands. Your mother was the smartest client I ever had. She knew exactly what Richard was. Then why did she marry him? Because she was dying, and she didn't want you to be alone. Margaret's voice softened. She thought she could protect you with legal documents. She almost succeeded. From her desk drawer, she produced a manila folder thick with papers. This is a certified copy of your mother's will. The original is filed with the Franklin County Probate Court. Richard doesn't know I have this. I opened it with trembling fingers. I, Eleanor Hayes Delaney, being of sound mind, hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my daughter, Ondine Eleanor Delaney. Everything, Margaret said. The house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it was placed in a UTMA account. That's the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. You've been the legal owner since the day your mother died. Richard is just the custodian. But he said, he lied. Margaret leaned forward. And on your 18th birthday, his custodianship ends. Automatically. He can't stop it. The room seemed to tilt. How much? As of last month's statement, $847,312.45. Margaret walked me through the law like a general explaining a battle plan. UTMA accounts are ironclad, she said, spreading documents across her desk. Your mother chose Ohio specifically because the age of majority for UTMA here is 18, not 21 like some states. She wanted you to have control as soon as legally possible. But Richard's been managing everything. He signs the tax returns. He talks to the bank. As custodian, he has a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest. Margaret's lips thinned. Based on what I've seen, he's been violating that duty for years. But that's a fight for after your birthday. Right now, we focus on what he can't touch. She pulled out a bank statement from First National dated February 2025. My name was printed at the top. Ondine Eleanor Delaney, beneficiary. This account exists independently of anything Richard controls. On April 15th, at 12:01 a.m., you become the sole authorized user. You can walk into any First National branch, show your ID, and access every penny. He's trying to transfer the assets before then. His letter said, he can try. Margaret's smile was sharp. But he'd need court approval to dissolve a UTMA account before the beneficiary reaches majority. Your mother made sure of that. She also filed a separate affidavit with the probate court, explicitly naming you as her sole heir and stating that any attempt to modify the trust should be treated as fraud. I stared at the documents. My mother's signature at the bottom of each page. Her handwriting, careful and deliberate, from a time when she knew she was dying and wanted to make sure I'd survive. There's one more thing. Margaret handed me an envelope yellowed with age. She asked me to give you this on your 18th birthday, but I think you need it now. The envelope was addressed in my mother's handwriting. For Ondine, when she's ready. I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. Some things need to wait for the right moment, and I wasn't ready to hear my mother's voice from beyond the grave, not while I was still living under the roof of the man who wanted to erase her. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange double life. At school, I smiled and turned in assignments and pretended to care about prom. At home, I performed the role of the obedient stepdaughter while quietly preparing to disappear. Breakfast on April 1st, 2 weeks before my birthday. Richard sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone. Bradley was shoveling eggs into his mouth, already dressed for his shift at the foundation office. I poured myself orange juice and waited. Big plans for your birthday? Richard asked, not looking up. Just dinner with some friends, maybe. Good. Keep it simple. He set down his phone and fixed me with a look I couldn't quite read. We should talk about your future soon, after graduation. Sure. I've been thinking about what's best for you, Ondine. A fresh start somewhere. Maybe out of state. My grip tightened on my glass. Out of state? Ohio has limited opportunities for young people. I have some contacts in Arizona. Good job market there. Arizona, 2,000 miles from Maplewood, 2,000 miles from my mother's grave, from Margaret Thornton. from anyone who might ask questions. That's something to think about. Think fast. Richard returned to his phone. These opportunities don't wait. Bradley caught my eye across the table. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Discomfort, maybe, or guilt. Then he looked away. I finished my breakfast in silence, calculating. 14 days. I could survive 14 more days. I just had to make sure Richard didn't figure out what I knew. The second meeting with Margaret happened on a Wednesday afternoon, while Richard thought I was at a dentist appointment. Her office felt different this time, less intimidating, more like a war room. She'd laid out documents across the conference table, bank statements, property records, copies of my mother's business filings. "I've been doing some digging," she said, sliding a folder toward me. "Your stepfather has been busy." The folder contained correspondence between Richard and First National Bank, dated January 2025. He'd requested a change to the UTM beneficiary designation. The bank's response was clipped and formal. Request denied. Beneficiary changes require court order or beneficiary consent upon reaching age of majority. He tried 3 times, Margaret said. January, February, and again last week. Each time the bank refused. So he can't take the money. Not legally, but he's clearly planning something for your birthday. She tapped the copy of his letter to the lawyer. Asset transfer should be completed before her birthday. He's not talking about the UTMA. He knows he can't touch that. He's talking about the house. My stomach dropped. The house is in Mom's name. It was. But Richard filed paperwork 6 months ago, claiming that Eleanor transferred ownership to him before her death. A quitclaim deed, supposedly signed in 2019. That's a lie. Mom would never. I know. Margaret's voice was steady. I have a copy of your mother's actual will filed with the probate court, which explicitly states the house goes to you. Richard's deed is a forgery, but proving that takes time you don't have. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a new bank card with my name on it, linked to an account at a different bank. Open this the moment you turn 18, transfer everything immediately, then get out of that house. I took the card. It felt like holding a key to a door I hadn't known existed. The plan came together in pieces, assembled during stolen moments when Richard wasn't watching. A small suitcase, packed with essentials, clothes, documents, the jewelry Mom had given me. I hid it in the back of my closet, behind winter coats I never wore. The Honda Accord's registration, which I found in the glove compartment during a practice drive, Richard had grudgingly approved. My name was on the title. Mom had made sure of that. A burner phone, purchased with cash from a convenience store in the next town. Margaret's number was the only contact saved, and the envelope. My mother's final letter, still unopened, tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. At 12:01 a.m. on April 15th, Margaret had instructed during our last meeting, log into the First National portal. Your access will activate automatically. Transfer the funds to your new account. I've set it up at Commerce Bank in Columbus, under your name only. Then leave. What about the house? We'll fight for it later, through proper legal channels. Right now, your priority is getting out safely with what's rightfully yours. I'd nodded, committing every step to memory. The night of April 14th, I set my alarm for 11:55 p.m. Richard had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. Bradley was out with friends. The house was silent. I lay in the dark, watching the minutes tick by on my phone. 11:50. 11:52. 11:55. The alarm vibrated silently against my palm. I opened my laptop, navigated to the First National website, and entered my credentials. Access denied. Account holder not yet of majority age. I refreshed the page. 11:58, 11:59, 12 equal, 12:01. I refreshed again. Welcome, Ondine Delaney. Account balance, 847,312.45. My hands were steady as I initiated the transfer, every cent, moved to Commerce Bank in Columbus. Then I picked up my suitcase, grabbed the car keys, and walked out the front door. I didn't look back. I drove through the night with the windows down, letting the cold April air keep me awake. Somewhere past midnight, On a dark stretch of I-71 heading toward Columbus, I finally opened my mother's letter. I pulled into a rest stop, turned on the dome light, and slid the paper from its envelope. Her handwriting, the familiar loops and curves I hadn't seen in 6 years, made my throat tighten. My darling Ondine, if you're reading this, then Margaret has done her job, and you've done yours. I'm so proud of you, baby. I always knew you were stronger than you realized. I wish I could have protected you from Richard myself. I saw what he was. Too late, but I saw it. By then, I was too sick to leave, and I was terrified of what would happen to you if I died in the middle of a divorce. So I did what I could. I built walls around everything I wanted to give you. Legal walls, paper walls, the kind he couldn't climb over no matter how hard he tried. The money is yours, the house is yours, but more than that, your life is yours. Don't let anyone, not Richard, not anyone, make you feel like you don't deserve to take up space in this world. I arranged everything because I love you, but you're the one who had to be brave enough to claim it. Go build something beautiful, baby. That's all I ever wanted for you. All my love forever, Mom. I sat in that rest stop parking lot for a long time, reading the letter over and over until the words blurred. Then I folded it carefully, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and drove on toward Columbus. My mother had given me a blueprint. Now it was time to build. Before I left Maplewood behind, I made one final stop. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation had its office in a converted Victorian on Main Street, 3 blocks from the town square. I'd walked past it hundreds of times but never gone inside. Richard had made it clear that foundation business wasn't for children. At 2 a.m., the building was dark, but even in the shadows, I could read the bronze plaque by the door. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation, established 2019. Building community, one family at a time. Richard Calloway, chairman of the board. My mother's name on the building. Richard's name on the leadership. I took a photo with my phone, evidence for later, and sat in my car, researching. The foundation's website listed its accomplishments: scholarships for local students, grants for small businesses, funding for the community center renovation. All of it attributed to the vision of our beloved founder, Eleanor Hayes, and the tireless dedication of Chairman Richard Calloway. The 990 forms, public tax records for nonprofits, told a different story. In 2020, the foundation reported $2.3 million in assets. By 2024, that number had dropped to $1.8 million. Administrative expenses had tripled. Consulting fees paid to R. Calloway Enterprises totaled over $400,000 across 5 years. My mother had built something real. Richard was draining it dry while wearing her name like a costume. I saved the screenshots to my cloud drive, adding them to the growing file of evidence. Someday, I would come back. Someday, I would reclaim what he'd stolen. But not today. Today, I needed to disappear. I pulled out of the parking lot as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. The rearview mirror showed Maplewood shrinking behind me. The town where my mother had lived and died, where I'd been erased from my own family. I wouldn't be erased anymore. I know this story's getting intense. Before we go on, if you're watching and you want to know what happened when Richard discovered I was gone, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I want to hear from you. What do you think Richard did when he woke up and found an empty room? Drop your guess in the comments below. Now, let me tell you about the morning after. The night before my birthday had been the longest of my life. I'd spent it in my childhood bedroom surrounded by memories I was about to leave behind. The poster of the solar system Mom had hung when I was 8. The bookshelf filled with novels we'd read together. The window seat where I used to watch thunderstorms roll across the Ohio sky. At 10 p.m., Richard knocked on my door without waiting for an answer. "Tomorrow's the big day," he said, leaning against the doorframe. His smile didn't reach his eyes. 18, a real adult. I looked up from the textbook I was pretending to read. "Yeah, feels surreal. We should talk in the morning, about your future, about what happens next." "Sure, after breakfast?" "After breakfast." He studied me for a moment, and I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching. You know, Ondine, everything I've done has been for your own good. Your mother would have wanted. I know. The words tasted like ash. I appreciate everything, Richard. His smile widened, satisfied. Good. Get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. He closed the door and I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Big day indeed. I checked my phone. 10:17 p.m. Less than 2 hours until midnight. Less than 2 hours until I became a legal adult with full control over my inheritance. Less than 2 hours until Richard's plan fell apart. I pulled my packed suitcase from behind the winter coats and set it by the door. The car keys were in my jacket pocket. The burner phone was charged. Margaret's number was memorized. At 11:30, I heard Richard's bedroom door close. At 11:45, the house fell silent. At 11:55, my alarm vibrated. It was time. 12:01 a.m., April 15th, 2025. The moment the clock turned, I refreshed the First National portal one final time. The screen flickered, loaded, and there it was. Welcome, Ondine. Eleanor Delaney. Account status. Active available balance. $847,312.45. I initiated the transfer to Commerce Bank with fingers that refused to tremble. The system asked for confirmation. I clicked yes. Transfer initiated. Funds will be available within 24 hours. I closed the laptop, slid it into my backpack, and stood in the darkness of my childhood bedroom for the last time. The house was silent. Richard slept down the hall, dreaming of whatever men like him dream about. Control, probably. Dominance. The satisfaction of crushing someone smaller. He had no idea that his carefully constructed plan was already crumbling. I picked up my suitcase, shouldered my backpack, and crept down the stairs. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a gunshot, but no lights came on. No doors opened. The Honda Accord sat in the driveway, keys in my pocket. My name on the title. My car, legally and completely. I loaded my bags into the trunk and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over on the first try. I backed out of the driveway slowly, headlights off until I reached the street. The house on Maple Creek Drive shrank in my rearview mirror. White colonial, black shutters, wraparound porch where my mother's ghost still lingered. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe him an explanation. At the end of the street, I turned onto the main road and finally switched on my headlights. The highway stretched before me, dark and empty and full of possibility. I was 18 years old, $800,000 richer and finally free. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in a coffee shop in Columbus, 2 hours from Maplewood, watching my phone light up with notifications I had no intention of answering. 15 missed calls from Richard's number, 23 text messages, escalating from confusion to anger. 7:02 a.m. Ondine, where are you? 7:15 a.m. This isn't funny. Call me back. 7:34 a.m. The car is gone. What did you do? 7:52 a.m. Ondine, call me immediately. 8:01 a.m. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're making a huge mistake. 8:15 a.m. The bank called. What did you do? I sipped my coffee and watched the messages roll in. There was something almost peaceful about it, watching him realize in real time that his perfect plan had collapsed. A new text appeared, this one in all caps. You have no idea what you've done. That money was for your future. I was protecting it for you. You're going to regret this. I screenshot the message and saved it to my evidence folder. Then I blocked his number. My burner phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. Bank confirmed the transfer attempt from Richard's end was rejected. He knows. Stay safe. I typed back, I'm in Columbus. I'm okay. Good. Don't go back. Don't contact him. Let me handle the legal side. The coffee shop was warm and bright, filled with college students and young professionals starting their days. Normal people living normal lives. I'd never felt more invisible, and I'd never felt more powerful. For 6 years, Richard had controlled everything: my access to money, my use of the car, my connection to my mother's memory. In one night, I'd taken it all back. I ordered a second coffee and started researching apartments. The call came at 6:17 p.m. on my 18th birthday. I was in a motel room outside Columbus eating takeout Chinese food and watching the local news. My real phone was off, tucked in the bottom of my suitcase. But the burner phone, the one only Margaret had the number for, suddenly lit up with an unknown caller. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. "Hello? Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Richard's voice was ice and venom, barely controlled. "You stupid, ungrateful girl. Everything I did was for you. Your mother would be ashamed." I set down my chopsticks. "How did you get this number?" "I have my ways. You think you're clever, running off in the middle of the night like a thief? That money was supposed to be managed properly. You're a child. You'll blow through it in a year and come crawling back. I'm 18, legally an adult, and that money was always mine. You don't know anything about the real world." His voice dripped with contempt. "You'll fail. You'll end up on the street. And when you do, don't expect me to take you back." I let the silence stretch for a moment. "Mr. Calloway," I said finally, my voice steady, "I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to explain myself. I'm simply going to say this once. Don't contact me again." "You ungrateful—" "Goodbye." I hung up, then powered off the burner phone and removed the SIM card. The next morning, I bought a new phone with a new number. Only Margaret had it. Richard Calloway had promised I'd come crawling back. 20 years later, he would be the one standing at my door. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 20 years is a long time to build a life. I spent the first year in Columbus, finishing my GED and working part-time at a property management company. The owner, a woman named Patricia, who reminded me of my mother, saw something in me and offered to pay for community college courses. By 2028, I had a bachelor's degree in business from Ohio State, paid for with scholarships and the interest from my inheritance, which I'd invested conservatively on Margaret's advice. By 2032, I'd founded Heartland Community Development, a company focused on affordable housing for working families. We started small, one duplex renovation in a forgotten neighborhood, then another, then a whole block. By 2045, Heartland had completed 47 projects across Ohio. Annual revenue, $28 million. Employees, 112. Families housed, over 2,000. I'd also gotten married to a man named James who taught high school history and made me laugh every single day. We had 2 children, Eleanor, 12, and Michael, 10. I'd built the life my mother dreamed of for me. But I never forgot Maplewood. In 2043, I hired an independent CPA to audit the Eleanor Hayes Foundation. The results confirmed what I'd suspected for years. Richard had siphoned over $400,000 in consulting fees and administrative expenses. The foundation that bore my mother's name was being used as his personal piggy bank. I could have gone public then. I could have destroyed him. Instead, I waited. In 2044, the foundation announced plans to build a community center in Maplewood, the Eleanor Hayes Community Center. They needed $1.5 million. They had $300,000. I made a single phone call to the foundation's development director. "I'd like to make an anonymous donation," I said, $1.2 million. On one condition. My identity stays private until the dedication ceremony. The director agreed without hesitation. Richard had no idea who was funding his crowning achievement. March 15, 2045. 1:30 p.m. The Eleanor Hayes Community Center gleamed in the pale spring sunlight, a modern building of glass and warm wood, designed to welcome everyone who walked through its doors. My mother would have loved it. I sat in my rental car across the street, watching the crowd gather. 200 people, maybe more. Local politicians in their best suits, business owners who donated smaller amounts, reporters from the Maplewood Gazette and Ohio Community News, cameras ready, families with children, excited to see the new gymnasium and after-school program rooms. And at the center of it all, Richard Calloway. He was 72 now, his hair silver, his posture still rigid with the self-importance I remembered. He wore a charcoal suit and a red tie, shaking hands and accepting congratulations as if he'd built the center with his own two hands. I watched him through the windshield, feeling nothing. No anger, no hatred, just a calm, clear certainty about what I was about to do. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Mercer, the investigative reporter I'd been working with for the past 6 months. I'm in position. Got the audit documents ready. Just give the signal. I typed back. Wait for my cue. Another text. This one from Margaret. Are you sure about this? There's no going back. I'm sure. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. 38 years old, professional blazer, hair pulled back, the face of a woman who'd spent 2 decades building something real, while the man who tried to destroy her built nothing but lies. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the crowd. The guest list included a name Richard hadn't recognized. O. Delaney, representative of anonymous donor. In 15 minutes, he would learn exactly who had funded his moment of glory. The ceremony began at 2 p.m. sharp. Mayor Patricia Holloway, no relation to my old mentor, took the podium first, praising the foundation's decades of service to the Maplewood community. She thanked the donors, the volunteers, the construction crews. Then she introduced the man of the hour. And now, please welcome the chairman of the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, a pillar of our community, Mr. Richard Calloway. The applause was enthusiastic. I stood near the back of the crowd, invisible in my anonymity, and watched him take the stage. Thank you, Mayor Holloway. Thank you all for being here today. Richard's voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent decades perfecting his public persona. 26 years ago, I lost my beloved wife, Eleanor. But her spirit lives on in everything we do here. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. I've dedicated my life to preserving her legacy. Every scholarship we've awarded, every family we've helped, every brick in this beautiful building, it's all for Eleanor. He paused, letting the emotion land. I want to offer a special thank you to our anonymous donor, whose extraordinary generosity made this center possible. $1.2 million. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching, thank you for believing in Eleanor's vision. He smiled, basking in the applause. I stepped forward. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the crowd noise, I'm right here. Heads turned. Richard's smile faltered. I walked up the center aisle, 200 pairs of eyes tracking my movement. The reporters' cameras swung toward me. Richard's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally, fear. Hello, Richard, I said, stopping at the foot of the stage. It's been a long time. The crowd fell silent. I'm Ondine Delaney. Eleanor Hayes was my mother, and I have some things to share. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the whispers started. A wave of murmured questions spreading through the crowd. Ondine Delaney? Eleanor's daughter? I thought she left years ago. Richard gripped the podium, his knuckles white. Ondine, this is unexpected. I'm sure it is. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage, my heels clicking against the wood. You weren't expecting to see me again, especially not today. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a family matter. Richard's voice strained for control. Perhaps we should. No. I turned to face the crowd. This is exactly where this conversation needs to happen. In front of everyone who believed in the Eleanor Hayes Foundation. In front of everyone who trusted this man. Mayor Holloway half rose from her seat. Ms. Delaney, perhaps this isn't the appropriate. Mayor Holloway, I'm the anonymous donor. I gave $1.2 million to build this center. I think that earns me a few minutes of your time. The mayor sat back down. I pulled a folder from my bag, the same folder Margaret had given me 20 years ago, now supplemented with 2 decades of additional evidence. 20 years ago, when I was 17 years old, I found a letter on Richard Calloway's desk. I held up the photograph, enlarged and laminated. 8 words that changed my life. I read them aloud. Once she turns 18, kick her out. She's not my daughter anyway. Gasps from the crowd. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Richard's face had gone gray. That's been taken out of context. There's more. I pulled out the next document. This is my mother's will, filed with the Franklin County Probate Court in 2019. It names me as her sole heir. Richard spent years trying to steal my inheritance. I looked at him. Would you like to explain, or should I continue? Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I continued. This is a certified audit of the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, conducted by an independent CPA in 2043. I held up the bound report, its cover clearly visible to the cameras. It documents over $400,000 in misappropriated funds, money that was supposed to help this community, diverted to consulting fees paid to R. Callaway Enterprises. I flipped to a flagged page. Page 47. Personal travel expenses, totaling $87,000, were classified as program costs. Page 62. Home renovation invoices for the Callaway residents were submitted as facility maintenance. Page 89. Tuition payments for Bradley Callaway were coded as scholarship disbursements. The crowd's murmurs had grown to a rumble. This isn't a family dispute, I said, my voice steady. This is fraud. Fraud committed against my mother's memory, against this community, and against every family who believed their donations were going to help people in need. Richard finally found his voice. You have no right. This is slander. I'll sue. Everything I've said is documented and verified. I turned to the reporters. Copies of the full audit, along with supporting bank records and correspondence, were submitted to the Ohio Attorney General's office this morning. Mr. Mercer from the Gazette has been investigating independently for 6 months. Daniel Mercer stood up, notepad in hand. Mr. Callaway, would you like to comment on the allegation that you forged a quitclaim deed to steal Ms. Delaney's childhood home? Richard's face went from gray to white. I think, Mayor Holloway said slowly, rising from her seat, we need to adjourn this ceremony, immediately. A board member I didn't recognize stood up. I move for an emergency vote of no confidence in Chairman Callaway. The second came before he finished speaking. I know this is the moment you've been waiting for, but the story isn't over yet. If you want to know what happened to Richard after that ceremony, and why he showed up at my door 20 years later, keep watching. And if you're thinking of someone who once treated you the way Richard treated me, share this video. Sometimes knowing someone else made it through is enough. Let me tell you what happened next. The vote took less than 5 minutes. 6 board members raised their hands for removal. Only Bradley Callaway abstained, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The motion carries, the board secretary announced, her voice shaking slightly. Richard Callaway is hereby removed as chairman of the Eleanor Hayes Foundation, effective immediately. Richard stood frozen at the podium, his world collapsing in real time. This is a mistake, he said, but his voice had lost its authority. I've given 26 years to this foundation. Eleanor wanted her daughter to inherit her legacy. I stepped forward, my voice calm but carrying. You tried to erase me, you tried to steal from me, and you used my mother's name to do it. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the cameras were still rolling. Daniel Mercer was scribbling furiously. 2 other reporters were already on their phones calling in the story. Mayor Holloway approached me, her expression a mix of shock and respect. Ms. Delaney, I had no idea. The city has worked with the foundation for years. The foundation can still do good work, I said. Under proper oversight. I'm prepared to continue my support, on the condition that an independent board is appointed and annual audits are made public. She nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Richard hadn't moved from the podium. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. The confident patriarch who'd controlled my childhood had shrunk into a confused old man whose lies had finally caught up with him. Ondine, he said, his voice cracking. Please, we can talk about this. We're family. No. I picked up my folder and turned away. We never were. I walked off the stage without looking back. Behind me, I heard the click of cameras and the buzz of a story spreading. The aftermath unfolded with the precision of a well-documented case. Within an hour of the ceremony's abrupt end, the Foundation's board convened an emergency session in the community center's conference room. I wasn't present, I'd said what I needed to say, but Margaret attended as my legal representative. She called me that evening with the results. They voted unanimously to restructure, she said. New bylaws requiring independent financial oversight, quarterly audits published on the Foundation's website, a community advisory board with actual community members. And Richard? Permanently barred from any leadership role. They're also referring the financial irregularities to the state attorney general for formal investigation. I sat in my hotel room processing. 20 years of waiting, and it had taken less than a day for everything to change. They offered you a seat on the new board, Margaret continued. I told them you declined. I don't want power over the foundation. I just want it to work the way Mom intended. I know. That's what I told them. She paused. They're renaming the position of chairman. It'll be executive director now, a paid professional, not a volunteer figurehead. The first candidate they're considering is a nonprofit management specialist from Cleveland. Good. Ondine. Margaret's voice softened. Your mother would be proud of you. Not for the confrontation, for building a life worth protecting, for coming back on your own terms. I thought about the letter in my jacket pocket, the one I still carried everywhere. Go build something beautiful, baby. I know, I said. Thank you, Margaret, for everything. For 20 years of everything. It was my honor. I could hear her smile through the phone. Now go home to your family. You've earned it. I booked a flight back to Columbus for the next morning. The headlines hit within 48 hours. Maplewood Gazette, March 17, 2045. Foundation chairman ousted after daughter exposes financial misconduct. Ohio Community News, March 18, 2045. Eleanor Hayes's daughter returns after 20 years, reveals stepfather's alleged fraud. Columbus Dispatch, March 19, 2045. Local developer Ondine Delaney confronts past, funds community center named for late mother. The story spread beyond local news. A regional NPR affiliate picked it up. A podcast about nonprofit accountability requested an interview. The narrative had legs: the wronged daughter, the scheming stepfather, the dramatic public confrontation, the decades of patient evidence gathering. I declined most interview requests. The story spoke for itself. The social consequences for Richard were swift and merciless. The Maplewood Rotary Club, the organization whose awards had replaced my mother's photographs, requested his resignation within a week. He complied without public comment. His country club membership was not renewed when it came up for review in April. Former colleagues who'd praised his tireless dedication suddenly couldn't recall working closely with him. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation in May 2045. They subpoenaed 25 years of foundation records, bank statements, and tax filings. I followed the case from a distance, through Margaret's updates and occasional news alerts. I didn't need to be involved anymore. The system was working the way it was supposed to work, slowly, methodically, with evidence and due process. Richard Calloway, the man who'd tried to erase me from my own family, was being erased from the community he'd spent decades cultivating. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt something quieter. The satisfaction of a debt finally paid, a wrong finally acknowledged. I went back to my life, my company, my husband, my children, and I let the justice system do its work. The investigation took 14 months. In June 2046, the Ohio Attorney General's office released its preliminary findings. Richard Calloway had misappropriated $412,000 from the Eleanor Hayes Foundation between 2019 and 2044. The funds had been used for personal travel, home renovations, and, as the audit had suggested, tuition payments for his son Bradley. The report was clinical in its details. Page 23. Mr. Calloway submitted reimbursement requests for a 2022 vacation to Scottsdale, Arizona, coding the expenses as donor cultivation travel. No donors were contacted during this trip. Page 47. Invoices for a $34,000 kitchen renovation at the Calloway residence were submitted as facility maintenance for the Foundation's office building. Page 89. 4 years of tuition payments to Bradley Calloway's graduate program were processed as educational outreach scholarships. No scholarship program existed in the Foundation's charter. Richard was not criminally charged. The statute of limitations had expired on most violations, and prosecutors determined that proving criminal intent, rather than mere negligence, would be difficult. But he was ordered to repay the full $412,000, plus a $50,000 civil penalty. The money, the Attorney General noted, would be returned to the Foundation's endowment. I received a formal letter from the AG's office thanking me for my cooperation in the investigation. I filed it with the rest of the documents, the letter, the will, the audit, the news clippings, in a folder I kept in my home office safe. Evidence of a life reclaimed. Bradley Calloway sent me an email 3 days after the report was released. It was short. Ondine, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I understand if you don't want to respond. I read it twice, then archived it without reply. Some apologies come too late to matter. Some bridges burn so completely that there's nothing left to rebuild. The years after the investigation were not kind to Richard Calloway. I didn't track him obsessively. I had a life to live, a company to run, children to raise. But news filtered through occasionally, carried by old Maplewood connections or Margaret's periodic updates. 2047. Richard sold the house on Maple Creek Drive, the house my mother had bought, the house where I'd grown up, the house he'd tried to steal through a forged deed. The proceeds went toward his legal debts and the court-ordered restitution. 2049. Bradley Calloway, now a mid-level manager at an insurance company in Cincinnati, stopped returning his father's calls. The discovery that his graduate education had been funded through charity fraud, that his degree was built on stolen money, had severed something between them. 2051. Richard moved into a small apartment in a declining neighborhood of Columbus. His Rotary connections, his country club friends, his Foundation colleagues, all had evaporated. He lived on Social Security and a modest pension from a job he'd held decades earlier. 2054. The apartment building was sold to developers. Richard, now 81, couldn't afford the new rent. I learned this last detail from Margaret, who still kept tabs on the situation. He's been calling around, she told me over the phone. Old acquaintances, distant relatives. No one's taking him in. What about Bradley? Bradley's wife won't allow it. She found out about the Foundation scandal and put her foot down. I sat with that information for a long moment. The man who'd planned to throw me out on my 18th birthday now had nowhere to go. What do you want to do? Margaret asked. Nothing, I said. He made his choices. I made mine. But I knew, somehow, that the story wasn't over yet. While Richard's world contracted, mine expanded. Heartland Community Development grew beyond anything I'd imagined when I started with that first duplex renovation in 2032. By 2055, we'd completed 63 projects across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Our model, affordable housing that didn't look or feel like affordable housing, had been featured in urban planning journals and replicated by organizations in other states. I stepped back from day-to-day operations in 2050, transitioning to a chairman role that let me focus on strategy and mentorship. The company didn't need me in the weeds anymore. It had its own momentum. James and I celebrated our 20th anniversary in 2055. He'd retired from teaching the year before, and we'd started traveling. Modest trips, nothing extravagant. A week in Maine, a long weekend in New Orleans. Time together after years of building. Eleanor, our daughter, was 17 now, the same age I'd been when I found that letter. She knew the broad outlines of my story, but not the details. Someday I'd tell her everything. Not yet. Michael, 15, had his father's easy humor and his grandmother's stubbornness. He'd never met Eleanor Hayes, but he carried her name as his middle name, and sometimes I saw flashes of her in his determination. I read my mother's letter every year on my birthday. The paper was fragile now, the creases worn thin from unfolding and refolding. But the words never faded. Go build something beautiful, baby. I had. I was still building. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation, under its new leadership, had become what my mother intended, a genuine force for good in Maplewood. I attended the annual gala every few years, anonymous in the crowd, watching her legacy finally fulfill its promise. I thought the story was over. I was wrong. April 15, 2055. 30 years to the day since I walked out of that house. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the doorbell rang. James was upstairs. The kids were still asleep. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door, expecting a package delivery or maybe a neighbor. I opened the door, and Richard Calloway stood on my porch. He was 82 years old. The silver hair I remembered from the ceremony had thinned to wisps. His clothes, a wrinkled button-down shirt and khakis that hung loose on his frame, looked like they'd been slept in. A single duffel bag sat at his feet. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Ondine," he said finally. His voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of its old authority. I didn't know where else to go. I studied his face, the sunken cheeks, the rheumy eyes, the tremor in his hands. This was the man who'd written that letter. The man who'd called me stupid and ungrateful. The man who'd promised I'd fail and end up on the street. And here he was, standing on my doorstep, asking for help. "How did you find my address?" "Public records. Your company's registered agent." He swallowed. I don't have anywhere else. Bradley won't. And the apartment." He trailed off, unable to finish. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing down on this single moment. The teenage girl who'd fled in the middle of the night. The woman who'd built an empire from the ashes of her childhood, the mother, the wife, the CEO, all of them looking at the man who'd tried to destroy her. "Why should I help you?" I asked quietly. "Give me one reason." Richard's mouth worked silently for a moment. "I don't have one," he said finally. "I don't have a reason. I'm asking." I let the silence stretch. "Do you remember what you wrote in that letter?" I asked. "The one I found on your desk." He flinched. "Ondine. Once she turns 18, kick her out. She's not my daughter anyway." I recited the words from memory, the way I'd recited them 1,000 times over 30 years. "You were counting down the days until you could throw me out of my own home. You tried to steal my inheritance. You used my mother's name to build your reputation while erasing me from her legacy." "I was wrong." His voice cracked. "I was so wrong. I didn't understand." "You understood perfectly." I kept my voice level, without heat. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think there would be consequences." He had no response to that. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a list I'd prepared months ago when Margaret first told me Richard was running out of options. I'd known this moment would come. I'd had time to decide what I would do. "This is a list of resources," I said, handing it to him. "Shelters, social services, transitional housing programs. Some of them are funded by organizations I support. They'll help you get back on your feet." He stared at the paper. You won't. "I'm not going to take you in, Richard." I said it gently without malice. "I'm not your daughter. You made that clear 30 years ago, and I don't owe you a home. But I'm also not going to leave you with nothing. That's the difference between us." Richard looked at the list in his hands, then back at me. "Is this really all?" he asked. "After everything?" "What did you expect?" I leaned against the doorframe. A tearful reunion? Forgiveness and a guest room? That's not how this works. I thought maybe time. Time doesn't erase what you did. It just gives you distance from it. I crossed my arms. I've had 30 years to process what happened, to build a life that has nothing to do with you. I'm not angry anymore, Richard. I'm just done. He stood there, diminished, clutching the paper like a lifeline. Your mother, he started. Eleanor. She would have... Don't. The word came out sharper than I intended. You don't get to tell me what my mother would have wanted. You spent 25 years exploiting her memory. You lost that right. The silence between us was heavy with decades of unspoken things. I forgave myself, I said finally more quietly, for believing you, for staying silent, for all the years I thought I wasn't good enough. That was the hard work. You? I shook my head. You have to figure that out on your own. Richard nodded slowly. A broken man accepting a verdict he couldn't appeal. Goodbye, Richard. I stepped back and closed the door. Through the window, I watched him pick up his duffel bag and walk down the porch steps, moving slowly, like every step cost him something. He paused at the end of the driveway, looked back once, then turned and walked away. I stood at the window until he disappeared around the corner. Mom? Eleanor's voice came from the stairs. Who was that? I turned to see my daughter, 17 years old, watching me with curious eyes. No one important, I said. Come help me with breakfast. That evening, after the kids were in bed and James was reading in the living room, I sat in my home office and opened the safe. The folder was still there, the letter, the will, the audit, the news clippings, my mother's final message. 30 years of evidence, 30 years of memory. I added one final item. The list of resources I'd given Richard, photocopied before I handed it over. Documentation, even now, even at the end. Then I closed the safe and sat in the quiet. 20 years of building, 30 years of healing, a lifetime of learning that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming someone your enemies can't touch. Richard Calloway died in 2058, 3 years after that morning on my porch. I learned about it through a brief obituary in the Maplewood Gazette. Richard Calloway, 85, former community leader, passed away at Shady Pines Care Facility. No services planned. I didn't attend. There was nothing left to say. But I did make one final gesture. Anonymous, of course. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation received a $100,000 donation that year, earmarked for a new program, transitional housing assistance for seniors aging out of the system. The kind of help Richard needed at the end. The kind of help I wished someone had given him, not for his sake, but because my mother would have wanted her legacy to help everyone, even the people who didn't deserve it. That's the difference, I think, between justice and vengeance, between boundaries and cruelty. I built something beautiful, just like Mom asked, and I made sure the door stayed closed to anyone who tried to tear it down. If you're watching this, and you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in your own life, know that you do. Know that you can build something they can't take away. And know that closing the door isn't the same as losing. Sometimes, it's how you finally win. Thank you for staying until the end of my story. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel like you didn't matter, I want you to know you matter. And sometimes the best way to prove it is to keep building, keep growing, keep moving forward. Now I have a question for you. If you were me, would you have opened that door? Would you have given Richard that list? Or would you have turned him away with nothing? I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone. Until next time, keep building